In May, we're also going to launch a new exhibit. And Level Up is an exhibit about gaming and writing, which is part of our conversation for tonight. So we will be exploring the people who write narrative games, the notion of players as part of the narrative process and the writing that goes into it, and how it's influencing our culture today. For those of you who may not recognize gaming as something as a part of your life, but you know younger people who think it's important, you may not realize that the gaming industry is somewhere around $120 billion a year in revenue worldwide, and that if you take all of Hollywood and all of the recording industry and combine the revenues for a year, it's still less than half of that. So it is a huge part of who we are as a country. So with that in mind, we've pulled together a special group of people. And we also have an exhibit that we are working in the planning process for 2026. And that exhibit will be on the intersection of religion and writing. And we are in the early stages of that. And so we happen to have some folks who are helping us with that exhibit and who have helped us with the new exhibit. And so I'm going to introduce our panel, and they're going to talk about how these two topics intersect between religion, gaming, writing, and which we called Gods and Gaming for tonight. So let me introduce quickly. On my left right here is Emily Cruz, who's the Executive Director of the Marty Center at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Her research explores how people's religious lives are connected to their ideas about gender, race, and the body. Emily is one of the lead advisors on a religion and writing exhibit. Right next to her is Keisha Howard, who is the creator of Sugar Gamers, an award-winning game entrepreneur. She is committed to innovation and inclusion in gaming and promotes games as a way to foster empathy, critical thinking, and personal growth. Keisha has been a key advisor on Level Up and will be part of a panel at the American Writers Festival on May 19th with other gaming writers. So we're excited about that. On the far side there, Alireza Doostdar, sorry, to get it right, is an associate professor of Islamic Studies and Anthropology of Religion at the University of Chicago Divinity School. His work is focused on Islam and anthropology and sociology and religion. And Ghnewa Hayek is associate professor and deputy dean of humanities of modern American literature and a scholar of modern American literature from the late 19th century to the present in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at the University of Chicago. And together, Alireza and Ghnewa are working on a study entitled Gaming Islam, which is a collaborative research initiative that explores representations of Islam and Muslims in video games and in the entertainment industry broadly. So, say welcome to our panel. Can you give them a round of applause? And I'm going to let Emily take over and lead the discussion.
All right, let's see if I can do this without dropping it. Aha, I did it. All right, we've started out well. Why don't we start by talking a bit about the relationship between gaming and writing, since that's why we're here. How can we think, maybe we'll start on the end with Alireza and then we'll come around. How can we think about the relationship between gaming and writing like poetry or writing novels, et cetera? What's the relationship between those and how do we kind of make sense of them? Is it the same? Is it different? How is that comparison enlightening?
Maybe Ghnewa should start answering because she's the literature expert.
I think the best analogy I have for this is that I'm a scholar of Arabic literature, and in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, which is when I started to become interested in Arabic prose. Arabic is a language of poetry, but in the 19th century, people are starting to write novels for the first time, and it's a very experimental form. They're super excited about the novel, and there are models. They're educated in French and English and German, and they have these 19th century reference, and they're trying to create something in Arabic that tells a story, that tells Arab stories in fiction. And the thing that's really interesting is the kind of stories they start telling are, because they're also trying to sell, much like Charles Dickens was, journals, they start to tell serialized stories. And these serialized stories, you know, every chapter leads up to some really tense moment, and then you have to buy the thing, you know, the next issue of this journal to find out what happens to the characters next. I mean, you're familiar with the concept, right? We sometimes get alienated from this when we read them as novels, but when we remember how people experienced them for the first time in the 19th century, we sort of get the idea. And this is a very long way of saying that when I first started playing Call of Duty Modern Warfare, which is a video game that was first released in the early 2000s, around the same time as the American invasion of Iraq, and then re-released in 2019. The first thing, and I had a really kind of defensive aversion to playing Call of Duty for the first time. I was like, this is just a shooter game and we're just gonna be like killing people and this is just gonna be awful. And I found myself incredibly immersed in the story of Call of Duty because it uses the same formal techniques, right? Every section is a chapter. It builds suspense. You're doing something new. And right at the moment of tension, the chapter ends. And then you're like, oh my God, I have to play ahead because otherwise I'm not going to be. So I think for me, form is a way to to make this comparison between the novel and especially the serialized, or it was my way to sort of enter into this world of gaming as narrative and the sort of the techniques that even the most commercial video games share with this kind of early experimental form. That was my entryway into sort of understanding this question, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sure. So I am a gaming consumer, and I've been one since the Game Boy came out. And before then, I was an avid reader. So I am 20 years before social media took over our lives. So I got to experience gaming in a very formative way. So if you look at gaming as an art form, like for me, playing a game was like reading a fiction book that I could play, that I could immerse myself in. So if I wanted to play Lord of the Rings, or playing Final Fantasy was like reading a Lord of the Rings novel where I could play one of the characters. And like, how immersive is that experience? And when it comes to reading and playing games of this nature, there's something that's triggered, your imagination. And for really powerful stories, it becomes a cornerstone of your identity if those stories touch you. Which is why, like, gaming for so many, not only, you know, is a core identity moment, but it's also a way, in a framework, a language that they talk to other gamers who have experienced this same experience in this like sort of fictional, imaginative world. Which is why it's so important to have so many different types of stories in this space. Because we're all like sort of searching for that art or for that narrative that impacts us as an individual and represents us, which is why we consume the media that we consume, whatever it is. So a lot of times we just don't make that comparison of games as an art form, writing as an art form, and that being a medium of expression, and how important that is to, you know, our essential humanity. So before you get to like, is the game profitable? Is the game this? Is the game that? Why do we play games in the first place? And why do we write stories? Why do we tell stories? All of those are core things that connect us as individuals and within our community. So it's really important to like think of games expansively, especially, you know, we think of it as entertainment, but it's entertainment that influences us and also works as a medium of expression for the stories that we tell.
I was inspired to add something about what I think is distinctive about games in relation to literature, which is, of course, every game will have writers working on it, and those writers do different things. They might work on the narrative, they might work on dialogue, they might work on character building, but there's also the structure of the game and the form of the game that has to be written, and that there's a difference with novels insofar as a game doesn't just go from point A to B. There are many different possibilities for the way that a game is played out, And in narrative games, in games that have stories, the story might play out differently and might end up in different places, and your character might develop in different ways depending on the choices that you make. So the way that identification, for instance, works with the playable characters or other characters in the game very much depends on the decisions that you as the player make inside the story while you're playing the story in a way that just is not, I don't think, possible with novels, or at least with typical novels. You know, there are, I remember reading these Dungeons and Dragons style books in the 1990s, like late 80s and early 1990s, where you basically read with dice and paper and pencil, and you had to sort of make certain decisions as you read the stories. So one game that I used to play in the 90s was called Conquest of the Longbow. It's still one of my favorite games of all time, about Robin Hood. And you know, it sort of had the standard Robin Hood story, but also you got to make decisions. Like you really needed to take on a beggar's garb to do a certain mission, and you learn some things within Nottingham. But then the way you acquired the beggar's garb was up to you. You could either pay money to a beggar on the highway to give up his clothing and then make friends with him, or you could threaten him and take the garb by force. And the way that you acted impacted the rest of the story. And I think it's really interesting to me also, as someone who was playing this as a teenager, and I grew up in revolutionary Iran, and sort of Robin Hood had a really significant place in my imagination. It was the Disney version was played on national TV every spring, every Nowruz. There were certain things that were changed, like King Richard wasn't in it because it was he was the champion. Because it was an anti-monarchist revolution. But playing it was really sort of, for me, it was like aspiring to be a Robin Hood type character. So also it wasn't just playing. It was also a certain kind of spiritual and ethical, sort of moral development type of exercise, even if I might not have imagined it precisely in those terms.
Yeah, so if you were someone who played that game and you beat up the beggar, you should be reflecting on yourself, I think. I should admit from the outset that I am not cool enough to play video games. Those are not my types of games. I'm amazed by people who do, who plot them, who know them. I am much more interested, well, at least much more capable when it comes to things called role-player games, a lot like what you were describing, or RPGs, they're often called. And probably the classic or paradigmatic one of those is Dungeons and Dragons. So this is where a bunch of nerds get together. You dress up in cloaks. You pretend you're different characters. So I also came to this game through Lord of the Rings. That's where my interest came from. Growing up being a reader of fantasy. Also not an unnerdy pursuit, but one I'm very proud of. And I think the thing that I find most interesting about those games is they're inherently about storytelling. That's what you're doing when you're playing them. You have a lead person, often called the dungeon master or the DM, who crafts the overall structure of the story, but then everyone gets to think about who they are. You get to build a character from the base. You get to decide what kinds of strengths do you have, how agile are you, how creative, noble, ethical are you, and then you work in community with other people to craft a story about how your person behaves. And there's some, it is a game of chance in the sense that you roll a god-awful number of dice, and you have to figure out how to play based on those things. So you can get tripped up and it can be complicated. So you have to make decisions like, do you attack or do you wait? They're inherently about deciding beginning, middle, and end. Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? Are you going to have an anti-hero? I think that the narrative structure of D&D is really what draws most people to it. That, and that you get to wear cloaks. Yeah. Not that I did that. I never did that.
Can I add one thing to this?
Please.
Just to sort of tie everything together, I think a lot of experimentation in prose fiction over the past 100 years is about precisely how close can you get to a self, right? To a subject, sort of, and you see the transition from the sort of third person perspective to the narrative I. And like for me, one of the really interesting things about gaming, whether you're in a space like Dungeons and Dragons is that the narrative I and the playing I become one. right? There's no, like when I die in Call of Duty, I die, right? It's not, oh, my character died, right? Whereas when, for example, a character dies in a novel, it's like, oh no, one of the Little Women died. Is it Beth?
Poor Beth. It was Beth.
Right? It's like Beth died, and you feel sad for Beth, but you're not Beth, right? Whereas what gaming collapses the narrative subject in a really kind of interesting way that sort of opens up to questions of its potential for helping you see sort of more abstract, kind of metaphysical and spiritual kind of narratives and experience them.
Yeah. I always sort of wanted to be Beth because she was so honest and pure, and I was definitely Joe, the sort of unruly one who was always reading.
Everyone wants to be Joe, right? They're just like the only good character,
Yeah.
which is the most sympathetic.
Right, and no one wants to be Meg or Amy.
No, or Amy.
Maybe this is a quiz that will follow. We'll send it to you.
It's like the 19th century Sex and the City. Who am I?
Gaming, as we've just shown in this little bit of the conversation, is huge. It's expansive. There are all kinds of games, all kinds of people play it. So let's narrow in a little bit toward the specific focus of the night and talk a bit about gaming and religion. What are ways that you can see representations of how you think about religion in gaming or the influence of them on one another? Yeah, Alireza, why don't you start this time?
Should I start? Okay. Many, many, many different ways. I think there are games where you literally can play God, and there's quite a few of those. So you get to build a society and experiment with it, and sometimes your role is described quite literally as God, and you can do acts of God, like bring either send blessings or send chastisements. But then it goes all the way from that to exploring, say, stories where religion figures in some role, sometimes more minor, sometimes more major. I think maybe more stories than I think are, more stories than maybe are productive or about fanaticism, where religion does come in, and I think that it shows certain blind spots in the way that narrative around religion is composed and assumptions about religion, and we can get into that if people want. Something else that I find interesting with religion is the way certain atmospheres are crafted in some games, where there is an attempt at least to produce a certain kind of spiritual experience, for lack of a better term. So there was a game called Journey, for instance, from, I want to say, a bit over a decade ago, which really became famous for this. It's there's no dialogue in the game. You're basically this one robed character. You never see the character's face, and you're running around these expansive vistas towards a destination that is not clear to you, and there's no explanation given for where you're going. You can't die in the game. You can't really fail. And those vistas include mostly desert-style vistas, but then other types of vistas as well. I remember reading on Amazon some of the reviews for the game, and some people were describing weeping as they played this game because of the way that it made them feel. And I played it myself because I was, I'm interested in religion, and I could see why this would happen. It's a very calming type of game, but it also it does this really nice job of creating a sense of transcendence through light, through sound, through a sense of space. And vastness, and your movement through the vastness. So the way that you just sort of are able to slide down, say, desert hills, and then all of a sudden fly through the air in a kind of almost a limitless fashion. So there's no, God is not in it. There's no direct reference to any religious ideas or doctrines or beliefs or anything like that, or rituals even. And yet it seems to do some work that we associate with certain kinds of religious practices and experiences. So really a wide field. And then on the dark side, we were just talking about this briefly, there are also games where you are put in a role where you can literally crucify somebody to a cross. And I think you can be crucified yourself also in some other games, but there are, you're essentially put in the place of a kind of an executioner or torturer, and you can choose to do it or not, but the game actually allows you, if you want, to follow through and with all the gory details. And what work, of course, each of these games does very different kinds of work, and some of them do multiple things depending on what choices you make, or even at once.
Yeah. Keisha, you want to go for it? Yeah.
Yeah, religion in games, in my experience, it links to the fact that, to your point, games as a transcendent experience. A lot of people think that the fun part about playing games is that the game is inherently fun, like all the parts are fun when you're pressing the buttons and all that other good stuff. But no, that's not really what happens. You have a simulated experience of anxiety, frustration, challenge. No matter what type of game you're playing, it's usually a simulation of something that we're sort of engaging with in real life, whether we put that into a fantastical or our fictional space, or a historical space, or what have you. We're creating a narrative, but as you said, where games collapse the space between the immersion between yourself and the character you're playing. This is where video games really can impact a person's identity around how they navigate faith, how they navigate challenge, and some of the core reasons that we explore our religious and spiritual selves. It kind of simulates a lot of those experiences. So when you win, it's meaningful if you go through this sort of character development of losing, of it being hard, of it being frustrating, you're trying to get past a level, there's some anxiety, and then on top of that game mechanic, if you add a compelling narrative that really sort of contextualizes those feelings that you're feeling to get through to the next level. Again, it simulates the kind of exploration that we have when we're in that introspective space calling on God, however we look at that, or calling on our faith in something that's beyond our physical understanding of the world, which is why these fictional stories that we play in games, or the representations of the stories that we're navigating are so important and can be so impactful, because they're touching at something very human about all of us and our exploration of self and our relationship to God.
Yeah. One of the most beautiful games I've played in the past few years is called Gris, like the Spanish and French word for gray, and it's a great game.
Yeah, it's great.
And you start playing it and you don't really know what it was going on, but slowly you realize as you move up through the levels that color is being added to this world that was once gray. And then you realize that the entire game is a kind of meditation on loss. You're mourning your parent in this game that has no language and no text whatsoever. It's just visual and musical, and slowly the story, like you recreate the story and you work through this kind of grieving process with the character, but you only realize it belatedly, once color starts emerging into the world and the music starts. So it's a narrative that doesn't need verbal language to express itself. It's using visual language and sound to sort of cause you to reflect profoundly on, the process of metamorphosis through through grieving, through mourning.
Yeah, and if I may, the games that you mentioned, Journey and Gris, I know it's probably pronounced different, but it's spelled Gris. I'm just like, ooh, is that how it's pronounced? But in games like that, once you complete them, you're left with this really interesting sensation in your human body,
right,
that is transcendent almost. It's like, wow, I got through something. That narrative, transformed me. Even if it was for a little bit, it puts you in a completely different state of mind that books also do, and games also acts as a medium for that. So, those two games are just perfect for that.
Yeah.
God, I want to play this game.
You should.
Or maybe I don't. I can't decide.
Oh, you all should play.
You should. It's also quite easy if you haven't played, or you work your way up.
That's good. I think role-player games are all about religion in a way that we conventionally define it. So they're woven through with ideas about ritual, about myth, about certain kinds of performance, that you observe a certain set of belief structures, that you're interested in self-discovery, that there is a divine figure or sets of figures, that there's something otherworldly or other than human that's woven through the story. You're often on a journey of seeking. And so I think that's particularly the case with Dungeons and Dragons. But interestingly, Dungeons and Dragons and other RPGs are often kind of given a bad name, and especially many of you will probably remember the Satanic Panic of the 80s. I grew up in the evangelical South. It was a bit before my time, but I am very familiar with the idea that D&D and other types of games are, that they're bad, that they're satanic, evil, or corrupted or corruptive in some kind of way. And I think partially that's, there's something frightening about the idea that you could achieve transcendence or build community in ways that are divorced from a conventional religious structure. I think it scares people who tend to be more orthodox, or, they just think elves are creepy, which they are, of course, wrong about. But interestingly, D&D is really modeled on actually multiple forms of really conventional religiosity, on Christianity, actually. One influence is Prussian role-player games, war games, which were about Christian dominion over certain parts of Eastern and Western Europe, the expansion of Christian empire in Europe. And then they're based on the work of people like Tolkien, who was himself an ardent Catholic, who wove Christian imagery and ideas through Lord of the Rings, who was in conversation with other profoundly committed Christians. And so there's a way that it's ironic that something that is based in certain kinds of Christian modes of being was, and I think sometimes still is, so frightening to many Christians. And I don't have an answer particularly. I don't think it's good or bad. But it's worth considering what it is that feels so threatening. And I do think sometimes it is the idea that you can fall in love with a story that might not be conventionally orthodox, that might absorb you. Yeah?
Oh man, I'm so excited to comment on that.
Yes.
So I love this conversation, gods and games, religious writing, games. Again, if you look at writing in and of itself as a medium of expression and art as a form of exploration in and of itself, in our narratives, we all explore these human emotions like fear and confusion and anxiety and expectation and so on and so forth. And I love how nice this conversation is, but most of us have probably read or written something that's unpleasant to experience. And that's why games are so, we're not just having these transformative or transcendent experiences because everything was fun and everything was good and everything was pleasant. There are some games that really explore that fear in ways that are almost even blasphemous. I don't know if you all have heard of Cult of the Lamb, for example, as a game. And there are a lot of horror games that use a lot of Catholic motifs and, those cliches to create an exploration of fear and horror. And it's really interesting how it's a game that you are exploring as an individual. But again, the transcendence doesn't necessarily have to come from a good, positive experience. And a lot of times when we're talking about games especially, we're on a moral binary, what's good, what's bad, good versus evil. And that's not what our personal explorations of our spiritual selves usually is about. It's landing somewhere that feels right for you within the context of what you're exploring spiritually. But it's usually not it's black and white. It's again an exploration of the narrative, of the story, so on and so forth. So I'm just glad that you mentioned that, because I'm this is gonna be such a nice conversation where everyone's hey, we love
games are so spiritual.
Nah, games violent, don't you Call of Duty over here?
Yeah. No, and actually this might be a good point for Alireza and I to talk about
Definitely.
how we ended up with gaming
Right.
Islam.
Well, let me say about something else before that, which is on this issue of morality and maybe lack thereof. It's interesting to me also when games are deliberately underwritten in certain ways to allow for more exploration and sort of less rigidness, and that it can go some morally dubious places. So in the famous Grand Theft Auto games, for instance, and I had never played. I don't know if you've heard of Grand Theft Auto. You know, I had never played them until very recently. I finally was like, okay, I'm working on games. I need to play Grand Theft Auto. So I installed Grand Theft Auto 5, which is the most recent one. And this is what's called a sandbox game, which means there's a kind of or sorry, an open world sort of sandbox game, which is it's a pretty big world. It's not completely open, but it's a huge world. It's essentially a number of cities, and you can drive through it, walk through it, ride a bicycle through it, ride boats, and so on, and interact with various what are called non-player NPCs, non-player characters, and you can do horrible things to them. Like you can buy weapons or acquire weapons and then just randomly shoot people. But you can also do other things, like you can go on a race. On a foot race with someone, somebody will just call you down and say, hey, you want to go on a run with me? And you'll go on a run, and then you can shoot them. Or you can like play tennis with somebody, and then you
You can shoot them while running so you can win.
yeah, exactly. Or you can I don't know, like you can pick up prostitutes and then you can shoot them. It's like it really, there's a way in which there's a certain kind of reward structure almost built into it, not in the sense that you get points, although you might actually get points. I haven't done that. But in the sense that it sort of, there's a way that it works with your sort of your brain wiring, sort of just the reward of going on a rampage.
Amorality.
It's a sort of kind of a Freudian id type of thing, right? It's like the erotic drive and the death drive together, almost all in one game. So it's really.
I like to think of Grand Theft Auto as a crime simulator. Yeah. So if you've ever wanted to commit a crime, Grand Theft Auto is the game that you pick up to explore that part of yourself
Safely.
Safely.
But I feel like it affects my driving. Like when I play enough Grand Theft Auto and then I get in a car, I'm like, and I don't literally, but it's like imaginatively. I'm at an intersection. I say, I can actually go in the sidewalk. I can see the way that it sort of begins to affect you. But it's also, these are complicated discussions, because then you're like, is it, if people do commit a crime, is it because, can we draw these causal connections or not?
Oh, wow.
And, certainly it allows you to explore.
Well, I'm going to be careful around the intersections of Hyde Park now.
It does explain a lot about Chicago drivers.
I think a lot of them, and the popularity of Grand Theft Auto. No, but I mean, I think, and on a sort of similar but a note, but that takes us in a different direction, I think one of the things that we've all been gesturing to so far is the sort of immersion of playing, of getting sucked into this narrative, into these worlds, whether they're kind of calling us to a path of kind of meditation, or working through some emotion and catharsis, or working through violence, or and I think maybe here Alireza and I can tell you a little bit about this project that is more about thinking together about representation and the way that religion gets represented in the service of these in the service of these narratives, and in a way that propagates certain binaries about particularly Islam in the Middle East, that sort of reinforce stereotypes in a way that can be dangerous, especially given how popular gaming is. So you only got half of the story in the intro. So gaming as an industry is bigger than the movies, music, all three of the most popular sports in the world, and books. It is the biggest, it dwarfs every other form of entertainment that we have created is dwarfed by gaming. And a lot of gamers are consuming these texts, and some of them are buying these small indie games, some of them are playing Grand Theft Auto, but a lot of them are not thinking about the images that are being thrown at them. And so one of the goals of our project was to create these videos to help people who might be gaming to think about specific kinds of stereotypes in games. And because we're both from the Middle East and kind of this is what we're interested in, we wanted to think about how Muslims and Islam are represented in video games, especially games like Call of Duty that are set in these nebulous Eastern countries where, you know, you can shoot veiled women and they're just characters to shoot. They don't have personalities, they don't have emotions. You are the only person as the soldier who does, and everyone else doesn't matter, in a sort of more disturbing way than in Grand Theft Auto. So that's kind of the impetus for the project. We'll be happy to talk more about this, but yeah, there's a dark side to the representation of religion in games. It's not all the sort of catharsis of working through something.
Everyone's so nice. No, I've played quite a few games with some upside down crosses and bodies everywhere. You know, like you grew up on Tolkien, or Tolkien was a formative thing. I've read fantasy, but most of the books that I really enjoyed were like Dean Koontz, Stephen King, you know. So more closer to that area, which I, you know, found those really interesting at the time. Were they nice and fuzzy? No. But, you know, I play the kind of games that have that sort of, that's that genre, right? Mm-hmm. And in those, like, you can have some really, you know, negative experiences, to your point, which is why more stories like, you know, what the project that you're working on absolutely need to be represented, because as big as the gaming industry is, encompassing all of those other industries, it still suffers from a monoculture. So we're hearing the same stories over and over again. We have the same insensitivities that we see toward different types of people over and over again. And it's like, all right, cool, can we do something else? And like, can we add to that? Like, I'm not even trying to fight it anymore. It's just giving opportunities from some new experiences, fresh perspectives, fresh stories. Like, you know, what if I could play a game that would give me, you know, more insight on, you know, a group of people that I, as an American, am not exposed to every day. Like, where I can, like, be immersed in a way that allows me to explore that, you know, as an individual. So, like, we have way too many games from a homogenous sort of perspective in game development and game writing. Mm-hmm.
I think one of the reasons that this is also really important, this kind of monoculture, as you point out, is that games are not just for playing. They do a lot of other things. So, you know, I mean, you might have heard the term gamification. So the way that gaming is now built into all kinds of other aspects of our lives, including if you're learning a language with Duolingo, you know, that's a very gamified app. If you're using various apps for going on a diet or for exercise, there's ways of gamifying that. For for buying things, there's gamified practices through which you're just made to buy more and more things. So, you know, it's disciplining us in particular kind of ways. Games are doing that. There's ways in which they're being deployed for buying things, for consuming things, and they're also being used in all kinds of political ways. So, you know, the games that we played, for instance, I mean, it's not insignificant that the version of the Call of Duty game that we played in the 2019 game, how much did it make? It made $1 billion in a month? In a month. In a month?
Yeah.
And then the second version, and then the 2021
version made $1 billion in 10 days.
In 10 days. But it's not, of course, the game is not made by the military, but it's used by the military for recruitment. And it's no accident, you know, it's a massive game, a massive part of popular culture. So recognizing the kinds of ways that games are problematic also says something about the ways that these are working in our world beyond just as entertainment.
And cannot be ignored, right? I mean, that's just, yeah.
I think as a sort of big picture conceptual place to end, that's really important because, I mean, some of us are, you know, I've spent my life learning about studying religion, and, you know, so have you. And I think we often find that it's easy to to imagine religion as purely kindness, niceness, that there is some universal core that's good, and that when things are bad or complicated or dark, that that's a sort of violation of religious ideas. And in fact, the more you study, the more you discover that religion, thank goodness, is far more complex than that. However you define it, it's really woven through with all kinds of darkness and negativity and possibility and beauty, sometimes right next to each other. And so it's really cool to think about gaming and religion as kind of connected in that way, not binary, far more messy, far more human, I think, in a really lovely way. Okay, maybe we should stop talking, I think, and let folks
you
ask some
ask
questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody have a question? Oh, yes, please, let's start here, and then we'll go here, and then back that way.
How much of this huge industry would you say the games are controlled by large public companies versus independent?
Great question.
What do you mean when you say large companies? Because
Well, let's say publicly held, the
Yeah.
famous shareholders.
yeah, I mean the games that you are going to hear about in our public discourse, that are in the news and so on and so forth, are absolutely like megacorps. So like when you think about AAA games and that sort of thing, like there's countless indie developers globally that are competing on a very regular basis to like get their game seen. So there's constantly new games coming up of all different kinds of experiences, but the games that are the ones that generate those numbers that we're talking about, like, it's worth over $150 billion. I think it's more than that at this point because the pandemic supercharged it. We were actually discussing screen addiction right before the pandemic happened, and then games became a solution to what was going on. The game industry has a whole lobbyist system. Like it's just like the industry in and of itself is just like any other corporation, industry corporation that you can think of, and how that would work. So think of Hollywood and the main movie production studios, and then all the smaller indie studios, and like how you see that content.
Yeah. Although interestingly enough, I just learned this, the lobby is not very keen on archiving. So there's a real tension, like about, similarly to cinema, to early film, 20th century film, like we have maybe 5% of all films extant that were made in the early decades of cinema. And similarly, like there's 94% of games that were made in the early decades of gaming, which wasn't even that long ago, are now lost to the records. And that has to do with the lobby and restrictions on who and how can games be archived. So that's a kind of interesting tangential question, but yes, the massive corporations.
Yeah, megacorps.
Megacorps.
Yeah, so just look up Activision, Blizzard, Nvidia, Epic, Unity. Just look those up if you're trying to, see where the money at.
All the fun games that we talked about, the spiritual games, though, and interestingly enough, that we were just talking about today, like the vast majority of those are actually made by small independent studios. Mm-hmm. So you can think about the quality.
Please.
Yes, I was reminded by your discussions of Joseph Campbell.
Yes.
Are you aware that you're thinking that you're entering a mythological world with games? And then I guess my other question is there's a sense that maybe all the world looks like a game when you come out of it.
That's true.
I mean, another game that I've been playing recently is God of War, which you may have heard of, and God of War is kind of a meeting point between Greek and Norse mythology. So it's like a Greek god going up against Norse gods, and then all this, lots of things happening in the meantime. So absolutely taking existing myths and making a playground of them, but with a really compelling narrative. But a compelling narrative that also allows you to smash people and like throw a battle axe and so on. Yeah. So it literally allows you to play God, but a particular kind of God.
Yeah, I think Joseph Campbell is really famous for this idea of a hero's journey. You know, he writes this like book that kind of took over the world at a certain era, you know, saying that there is a consistent leitmotif or a thing you can see in every myth, or myths of every culture at least, that's about a hero and what happens to the hero. And they go through these very particular steps and they do these very particular things, and it was extremely persuasive. And people who wrote following that, including the people who, you know, constructed the entire world of Star Wars up to this very moment, embraced the idea that there's this mythic journey that all heroes go through. Most of those heroes, of course, are men in the stories they're told, and they look a certain way and do a certain thing. And then scholars of myth really said, "You are so wrong, Joseph Campbell." And so most people who study myth academically think Joseph Campbell is silly. Maybe not he himself, but his arguments. And so there's a really interesting tension between the idea that has been so persuasive to storytellers, including gamers or people who are writing games, narrative, people who are structuring narrative, and scholars who think they know better. Joseph Campbell's stories are really, I mean, the story is really compelling, but is there evidence to say that's actually how myths work? A lot of people would say no. And so it's really interesting to look at games and lots of other stories too, and big movie franchises, and say, oh, how seriously should we take this idea that this is a universal trope? Yeah, my doctoral advisor would say, please don't take it seriously. Yeah. Oh, here, let's go here, and then we'll go someone in the back who I didn't see. Carrie, if you want to field the questions, you can probably see better than I can. I'll trust you. Okay. Oh.
I was intrigued by thinking about the game. I'm not a gamer, but I realized that there's, you described it, you know, depending on your choices, you'll go different ways. I wanted to ask about, I guess, the game, the specialist or law people, like, what is the actual, how do you go about, you have, how do you determine what the statistical human tendency would be? Because you can't write every scenario.
Right.
And how do you guys go about that? And then the next question I would say is, how is AI? It seems like you guys would embrace AI versus be resistant.
I knew an AI question was going to come up. I couldn't wait. I knew AI was going to come up.
Yeah,
It's
this is all you. Take it. Take it.
Well, I mean, you got to think about writing, and essentially you're writing in 3D, as I kind of think of it, because you're putting yourself. That's what I love about games. It combines so many different skills. So it's like, who are your, audience members, and what experience are you trying to give that player? So my favorite game for what you're talking about, and also not all games are created where you make different decisions and you have different outcomes. Those games are typically huge, but it's actually my favorite genre of game, which is called immersive simulator. So immersive simulators allow you to make all of these sort of customized decisions in an open world. But yeah, it takes a lot of people, a lot of writers, a lot of different people that are creating lore around everything that you're touching. It doesn't take one person. So a lot of times when we think of these huge companies and these huge products, there's one person that's like the face of it. Elon Musk, he made all the Teslas by himself. He's just one person working in the Tesla factory, inventing, thinking, manufacturing, all by himself. You don't think about the, hundreds of other, or thousands of other scientists and different individuals that contribute to that end result. And that's how games work a lot of times in the bigger games. Like, you're taking, a group of multi-skilled people and you're looking at like this problem. How do we create an experience for this player? And a good writer is going to do research. They're going to talk to different people about like the experience that they would want to have if they were in this narrative. And it's just a lot of work, and it's hard for one individual to do, which is, one of the misconceptions about working in the industry. It's teamwork. So imagine you have, instead of one writer, you have like 5 different perspectives, typically at minimum, if you're working in an indie game studio, that's able to contribute to a narrative overall, adding their own different lived experiences and expectations of play, which is really important. So it takes narrative designers, it takes game designers, it takes level designers, it takes all audio programmers, so many professional to kind of execute that. AI is one of the reasons why you may have seen all of these layoffs. It has completely sort of taken a lot of the human narrative, condensed it in such a way that we can have less individuals on a team, which is scary. That's a frightening thing to explore. We explored it once with Terminator, I think, but I don't know who wrote that, but I hope they're not too spot on. But one of the things that was interesting when exploring the idea of AI, we all thought that AI was going to help us like with a robot folding laundry and moving boxes, but it's really kind of taking over some of our intellectual thinking, our creative thinking, the creativity that's supposed to make us human. And for people to be out of that kind of work is frightening. But yeah, that's what AI is doing. It's important to absolutely know about its impacts, its ethics, and the regurgitation of stories that have already been told. So like, are we really being innovative when we're just depending on data that tells you that like, okay, people they're gonna like it, they're gonna consume it, probably because there's nothing else to watch. We're not, moving in that space where we're constantly, sort of working on what's going to move us. We're constantly working on things that you're going to consume and pay attention to. And that's what AI is, sort of speeding along. So there's some bad parts to it, but it is absolutely efficient, being able to take data from the millions of stories and games that have been written already. Of course it's going to be better than us, and of course they're going to use it, and of course it's going to be cheaper than a real person.
I think it's helpful to think about the very different things writers can write in the sense of the kinds of experiences they make possible and what might be possible with AI versus what might not be possible. So there are the games that are really attentive to what players want to do, right? I think Grand Theft Auto, for instance, is one of those examples. It's like, okay, people want to be violent, and we're going to give them the opportunity to be violent. But then there are games that, every game has limits, every game has constraints, it has rules, and those rules might not be immediately apparent to you, but they're there. I mean, one of them is space is not infinite. At some point, you're going to probably run into some kind of boundary or something like that. Or there's not an infinite number of things you can do to things around you and so on. But I think one of there's really interesting ways that writers can use and designers use constraint in creative ways. They deliberately use constraint in creative ways. So narratively, for instance, giving you choices that you might not immediately think of doing yourself. They're not the things that you would necessarily want to do. They're the things that the character in the game wants to do, say as a drug addict who is down on his luck and is really depressed, right? So I'm thinking of Disco Elysium, for instance, right? You're given a series of really bad choices at some points, and then you see the consequences of each of those really terrible choices when you play them. Now this takes really creative, innovative thinking, in terms of psychology, in terms of narrative, in terms of character building, all kinds of things. Is AI going to be able to innovate in that way? The way that AI is structured right now is no. It's just it's like regurgitation, as you put it, really out there.
Yeah.
Let me take one more question.
I just wanted to hear your perspective on how gaming is influencing the youth, particularly around addiction and desensitized to violence and that kind of stuff.
I would say the biggest challenge with how gaming influences our youth is that it's replicating the third space that we need. So young people don't have so games aren't supposed to replace real life. supposed to be a fictional place. But recently, games is where a lot of young people have a sense of community in this digital space. They trust their digital friends, and it's a real feeling. Parasocial relationships are a real thing that happens, and they live online. And that's a really scary thing, because there's not a equal catharsis outside of that online space where they can go meet their friends, or especially in the neighborhoods that I'm in, where, after that game, those hours in Fortnite or Call of Duty or Destiny or whatever game that they're playing, after that, they're actually meeting and interacting and sort of engaging in real life. And that has some tremendous impacts when people are in isolation. It definitely contributes to, the mental health challenge that we have. And it definitely is an incentive for game companies to continue having these community algorithms that young people need to connect. It makes it vital.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that really gives me hope, I think that is the predominant experience, especially talking to college students. I'm sort of amazed by college students who graduated from high school during the pandemic, who spent a year and a half, 2 years with most of their lives being on Zoom or on a screen. But I do think with the right shaping and opportunity, it's incredible to see how games teach them to read stories, to read narrative, to understand the building of a character and how that reflects the building of a self or doesn't reflect it.
Yeah.
I think there's an incredibly rich way to become a sophisticated reader and writer, and I mean that in a really big sense. An analyst of culture through RPGs, through video games, through the thing that, a lot of people are doing with huge chunks of their day.
And I don't want to dismiss these actually really valid concerns and cultural interpretations. But I'm just going to say, I suspect a good amount of the people in this room today were told at some point in their young lives that they should step away from that book, and what are they doing with that book in their hand for hours? Just to sort of add to this kind of a historical perspective, the novel created a moral panic in in its early years, right? Especially around young girls kind of getting sort of torn away from reality and just spending hours kind of in these fictional worlds, right? And I think that there is an insidious element to gaming that has to do with corporations and the sort of the world that we live in now, where this kind of desire to keep selling is producing a kind of perhaps people are turning a blind eye in the interest of profit to some of the more nefarious aspects. But just to sober this up with a little bit of you clearly turned out more or less okay, I assume. As a person who spent their childhood being told that I should stop reading and start paying attention to where my feet were and, not falling down the stairs and then eventually stop watching movies, blah, blah, blah. So it seems to me that sometimes any new genre or form of entertainment, particularly one that is enthusiastically embraced by young people, is probably with some validity kind of seen skeptically by older generations, but just kind of balance that out with a historical perspective.
Yeah.
With a that we need to be healthily skeptical about corporations. I just think it's not just, it's not the stories or the. And I say this as someone who's making who's making YouTube videos about how representations are.
I think very briefly, part of this just goes back to Keisha's point, which is what kinds of games are we playing?
Right.
What's available, and what's being crowded out, right, by the fact that the sorts of games that we're playing are a very particular sort.
And how can we give people tools to understand, especially young people, to critically understand and sort of step away from, and be able to step back and take a critical perspective?
I can't, and in the case of your question, I just can't advocate for media literacy enough.
Exactly.
Games aren't going anywhere. Kids are going to get them. That's where they're going to find friends. no matter how many restrictions you put on them. And that's where it's at. So like media literacy, so real human support systems, so that people, you know, especially young people, don't go too far over into a space without like a counterbalance of real life connections, friends, family, and so on and so forth. Like a support group can't solely be in a digital space. And like for a lot of gamers, that isolation, I would say, would be the most challenging part of it. Like the simulation of being in community and the reality of being disconnected at the same time.
Yeah.
I would say with that, I think we've had a longer discussion than I expected, but I think we're all enjoying it. And if you wouldn't mind thanking our panelists for coming out.